Hello everybody, AtMule245 here and welcome back to another video. Sorry for the recent lack of uploads. There is no excuse for it other than the fact that I am not as motivated to create videos as I was in the first 2 weeks of actually posting on my YouTube channel. This is because I have no real incentive to continue forward other than a fun hobby to pursue over the summer and a dream of someday making it big. To help keep me motivated and working towards my dream and maybe even someday making it a reality, I will kindly request for you to like the video and subscribe to my currently small YouTube channel to help it grow and be promoted in the algorithm. Thank you for doing so if you have. With that out of the way, let's continue forward onto the video. Hardcore Minecraft, whether love it or you hate it. It's survival mode but with a twist, that being once you die you can never respawn. It's over. Also, the difficulty is locked on hard, but that isn't very important in my opinion. However, this did not stop people from using it as a way to show their creativity and skill. Take Looney as an example. His hardcore world is absolutely insane, consisting of several extremely impressive megastructures. Go check him out if you haven't already. Huge props to him. Anyway, the best way to preserve the longevity of any hardcore world is to avoid things that can kill you. But what is the thing that poses the biggest threat to you, the player? In today's video, we will be analyzing just that in 2 sections. Causes of death, being what has killed you, and activity during death, or what you were doing immediately before you died. For each of these, we'll be seeing what the most deadly activity or thing is in the early game before the player gets diamonds, mid-game after the player gets diamonds before gear is maxed or the dragon is killed, late game after the player has either obtained maxed gear or beat the game but not both, and end game after the player has both obtained maxed gear and beat the ender dragon. To find these statistics, I've gone through the pain of watching a hardcore mode death compilation just for today's video. To show sympathy for the pain that I've gone through, please smash the like button and punch the subscribe button. We will then review the top 5 overall causes or activities of death and determine what the most dangerous thing is in Minecraft, what to avoid in hardcore Minecraft. So let's get right into it. As a surprise to no one, the most common cause of death in early game hardcore mode is the creeper, consisting of 46.1% of all early game hardcore deaths, making it the most common cause of death in the early game and the mob to avoid and be careful about the most in this stage of the game. We all know what this monster is. In case you don't, it is a mysterious green enemy without arms and a very unique looking face that spawns in darkness. It will run towards you and explode in your face, doing more damage in a single hit than anything else I can think of off the top of my head. In second place for causing the most hardcore deaths in the early game is actually a tie between lava and skeletons, both being the result of 15.4% of these deaths. Mid-game. As it happens, the most common cause of death in mid-game hardcore mode is actually fall damage rather than creepers. Fall damage occurs when you fall from more than 4 blocks and deals varying amounts of damage depending on the height fallen from, which has no upper limit. Fall damage happens to account for 26.3% of these deaths, making it the thing to be most careful about in the mid-game of hardcore mode. In second place is unsurprisingly creepers, accounting for 21.1% of hardcore deaths in the mid-game. Late game. The most common cause of death in the late game stage of the game just so happens to be the void! The void can be found in 2 ways, each taking significant effort. You can either break the bedrock at the bottom of the overworld or nether using exploits that has no purpose whatsoever, or you can alternatively go into the end dimension where the void is too easy to access if anything. When you go into the void, you will quickly take damage until you die. Because blocks cannot be placed in the void, you would need to have an elytra and fireworks to escape, making it one of, if not the most deadly things that can be encountered in survival Minecraft and the thing to be most careful about in late game hardcore mode. In second place is a tie unsurprisingly between fall kinetic damage and creepers, both making up 18.2% of the late game hardcore mode deaths. Endgame. You may be wondering what the most deadly thing is to endgame hardcore mode players. The answer is fall or kinetic damage, causing a whopping 27.3% of endgame hardcore deaths, and making it the thing to be most careful about in endgame hardcore mode. For those who do not know, kinetic damage is the damage you take when you ram into a wall with an elytra. The second most deadly thing in the endgame is once again another tie, this time between the void and surprisingly Enderman, each causing 18.2% of endgame hardcore deaths. Now let's move on to the top 5 overall most deadly things to hardcore players. Number 5, Enderman. Endermen are the result of 5.6% of all hardcore mode deaths, making them the 5th most deadly thing in hardcore mode and the 2nd most deadly mob. These deaths make up 0% of early game deaths, 5.3% of mid game deaths, 0% of late game deaths, and 18.2% of end game deaths, and 5.6% of all hardcore deaths. Watch out for these tall, teleporting, hard-hitting monsters. Number 4, lava. Lava is the result of 9. These consist of 15.4% of early game hardcore mode deaths, 15.8% of mid-game hardcore deaths, 0% of late-game and end-game hardcore deaths, and 9.3% of general hardcore deaths. Watch out for this fiery fluid, which is extremely common in the Nether. Number 3, the Void. The Void is also the result of 9.3% of all hardcore mode deaths, making it a tie for the third most deadly thing in hardcore mode. These consist of 0% of early and mid-game deaths, 27.3% of late-game deaths, and 18.2% of end-game hardcore mode deaths, and 9.3% of all hardcore deaths overall. Watch out for this all-consuming and never-ending pit, especially when in the end dimension. Number 2, fall or kinetic damage. Fall or kinetic damage, the result of 20.3% of all hardcore mode deaths, making it the second most deadly thing in hardcore mode. These consist of 7.6% of early game hardcore deaths, 26.3% of mid game hardcore deaths, 18.2% of late game hardcore mode deaths, and 27.2% of end game hardcore mode deaths, and finally 20.3% of all hardcore mode deaths. Watch out for cliffs, okay? Number 1, creepers. Creepers are the result of 22.2% of all hardcore mode deaths, for a whopping 46.1% of all early game hardcore mode deaths, 21.1% of all mid-game hardcore mode deaths, 18.2% of all late-game hardcore deaths, and 0% of all end-game hardcore deaths. Watch out for these exploding green creeps, which are the most deadly thing in hardcore Minecraft, or, in other words, what to avoid in hardcore Minecraft. Now, with that out of the way, let's move on to the most deadly activities during death. Early game. The most common activity that resulted in death in early game hardcore mode was caving and mining in the overworld, making up 36.4% of all hardcore deaths in the early game. Caves are very dark and often spawn large quantities of deadly mobs such as the aforementioned Endermen or Creepers. There are also lakes of molten lava and dangerous and steep ravines, and are nearly required to beat the game. Thus, there is no wonder why caving and or mining in the overworld is the most dangerous activity in the game of Minecraft. In second place is exploring the Nether, making up 18.2% of early game hardcore deaths. Mid-game. In mid-game hardcore mode, the most deadly activity is also caving or mining in the overworld, this time making up 26.3% of hardcore deaths in that stage of the game. In second place is a three-way tie between hunting in nether fortresses, exploring the overworld, and hunting mobs in the overworld, each causing 15.8% of hardcore deaths in mid-game. Late game. The most deadly activity in hardcore late game is actually building for looks in the overworld, resulting in 36.7% of those deaths. This makes sense because it is a very common thing to do in Minecraft, and nothing in this wonderful game is risk-free. In second place is a tie between end busting and caving or mining in the overworld, each causing 27.3% of these deaths. Endgame. The most deadly activity in hardcore endgame is surprisingly a tie between building for looks in overworld and building or using farming infrastructure in overworld, each causing 20% of endgame hardcore mode deaths. These activities are surprisingly dangerous, yet these are probably just because of how common they are. It is not possible to avoid these, but when engaging in these activities, just watch out and make sure you do not die. Now let's move on to the top 5. Number 5, Tide. For number 5, there are too many Tide activities to put in the top 5 list. I hope you understand and enjoy the rest of today's video. Number 4, Exploring in the Overworld. The third most deadly activity in hardcore Minecraft is another Tide. The first of these Tide activities is exploring in the overworld, causing 9.8% of hardcore deaths. These are made up of 9.1% of early game deaths, 15.8% of mid game deaths, 9.1% of late game deaths, and 0% of end game deaths. Number 3, hunting mobs in the overworld. The other Tide thing for the third most deadly activity is hunting mobs in the overworld, also being the result of 9.8% of hardcore deaths, consisting of 9.1% of early game deaths, 15.8% of mid-game deaths, 0% of late-game deaths, and 10% of end-game deaths. Number 2, building for looks in the overworld. The second most deadly activity in hardcore Minecraft is building for looks in the overworld, making up 13.7% of hardcore deaths. These deaths are made up of 0% of early-game deaths, 5.3% of mid-game deaths, 36.7% of late-game deaths, 20% of endgame deaths, and finally 13.7% of hardcore deaths overall. This is without a doubt the second most dangerous activity in hardcore Minecraft. Number 1, caving or mining in the overworld. The overall most deadly activity in hardcore Minecraft is undoubtedly caving or mining in the overworld, making up 25.5% of all hardcore deaths. These are comprised of 36.4% of early game deaths, 26.3% of mid game deaths, 27.3% of late game deaths, 10% of endgame deaths, and finally 25.5% of all hardcore deaths. This makes it the most deadly activity in hardcore Minecraft. Imagine you are minding your own business and you just found diamonds in a ravine when a creeper drops from above, hisses, and blows up, killing you in the process. This is how you are most likely to die in hardcore Minecraft. Caving and creepers are what to avoid and never possible in this game mode, what to avoid in hardcore Minecraft. With that out of the way, please like the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel because I am doing a voice reveal at 5,000 subscribers, and jokes aside, have an amazing day and goodbye.